A little girl went out to play near her home and disappeared without a trace. Her disappearance sparked the largest search operation in the country's history. But despite everyone's efforts, she was never heard from again. For days, there were no answers. But then investigators uncovered a series of disturbing clues that finally revealed the truth behind this dark and disturbing case. April Jones was born on April 4, 2007, in a small British town called McCandley. It was a quiet, peaceful place with a population of just over 2,000, far from any major cities. April was the youngest in the family, with an older brother and sister. She loved spending time with her friends, riding her favorite pink bike around town, and swimming. In 2012, when she turned 5, April started elementary school. She immediately stood out as a bright and determined student, and her teachers adored her. She was also a social butterfly and made friends with other children almost instantly. On October 1, 2012, April went to swimming lessons at a local sports center while her parents attended a school meeting. Afterwards, she invited her friend over, and her parents drove them home. The girls watched a cartoon together, and around 7 p.m., April wanted to go out for a walk. At first, her mother hesitated because it was already getting dark, but April found a way to convince her anyway. She'd done well at school the day before, so as a reward, her mom finally decided to let her go. She simply reminded the girls not to stray too far from home. And with that, April grabbed her bike and set off. About 20 minutes later, April's mom went out to call her at home, but she wasn't anywhere. She immediately panicked. She began searching the nearby streets, hoping to see her daughter. The neighborhood was on the outskirts of town, a small residential area with several apartment buildings. She walked around, checking behind buildings, but there was no sign of April. Finally, she spotted April's friend and rushed over to ask if she'd seen her. Her friend's response sent chills down her spine. The girl told her a car had stopped next to them. April spoke to the driver, got in, and they drove off. Upon hearing this, April's mother panicked and immediately called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at their home and spoke first with April's friend. She described the vehicle as a gray van and said the driver was a man with dark hair and a beard wearing a green jacket and sweatpants. He had a good look at him because he had gotten out of the van and helped April get in. The mother later explained that April was having a brain seizure, which made it difficult for her to get in on her own. April's friend also said something that seemed strange. She said that April had gotten into the van from the driver's side. The police immediately realized that the vehicle was likely a left-hand drive. This was noticeable because in the UK, most cars have the steering wheel on the right-hand side. April's friend had simply assumed she was getting in the driver's seat, but in reality, she was probably getting into the van from the passenger side, realizing that April had most likely been kidnapped. Police immediately called for backup and declared the incident critical. A massive search operation was launched, and investigators sent out an alert with details about the suspect and his van. News of April's disappearance spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood and then beyond. Dozens of people gathered outside her home, eager to help in the search. But at that point the crowd actually made things more difficult for the police, who had to go door to door interviewing every resident. Meanwhile, people began sharing the news online, attracting even more volunteers to the area. As the night went on, hundreds of people joined the search, taking to the streets alongside law enforcement. The situation was so urgent that even the local garbage collection service stopped working as every single worker quit their jobs to help search for April. Soon, the case made national headlines. News outlets picked up the story, and the police put out a public appeal asking anyone with information to come forward. They released April's photo and a description of the suspect, and tips soon began to pour in. Sadly, despite extensive efforts, the search yielded no results. In the early hours, they searched the entire town, but there was no sign of April. The next step was to search the surrounding forests and fields, but that was easier said than done. By then, it was pitch black outside and it had started to rain. The terrain around the town was rugged and difficult to navigate, and the officers knew they wouldn't be able to cover much ground during the night. Still, they refused to stop. The search continued into the morning, and as dawn broke, more volunteers joined. Some had even traveled from other cities to lend a hand. Meanwhile, the police stepped up their efforts, posting missing persons notices on billboards outside the city, hoping to get some leads. As news of the case spread across the country, the police were inundated with calls. But most of the reports led nowhere. That morning, one name kept popping up. A name mentioned by multiple callers. It was local resident Mark Bridger, 46. He quickly became a person of interest for several reasons. First, he matched the description of the suspect. Second, he was one of the few people in town who drove a left-hand drive vehicle. But the biggest red flag was that someone had spotted Bridger's car near April's neighborhood, right around the time she disappeared. When the police began investigating Mark Bridger's past, they discovered a lengthy criminal record, though his crimes were mostly minor or moderate. He had been arrested multiple times for assault, theft, and various offenses such as driving without a license. Detectives started tracking him down and found a few addresses where he might be staying. They sent officers to all of them at once, but Bridger and his car were gone. Then, a few minutes later, detectives had a breakthrough. A police helicopter spotted him walking his dog not far from his home, but what really stood out was his demeanor. The helicopter had been circling for almost half an hour and he never looked up once. Shortly afterward, a police officer approached Bridger and asked him to identify himself. He gave his name and immediately added, "I know what this is about." The officer then asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Where's April?" Bridger replied, "It was an accident. I hit her with my car." He was arrested shortly thereafter and taken to the police station. He continued talking on the way there, even though the officer hadn't asked him any further questions. He claimed he had no idea where April was because he was unconscious. According to him, after he accidentally hit her with his car, she was unresponsive. He panicked, put her in his car, and tried to administer first aid, but it was no use. He then said that for hours everything was empty, and when he arrived, April's body was gone. Bridger insisted that after realizing what had happened, he spent the entire night searching for her, wandering through forests and fields. He also claimed that he only discovered April's identity that morning, when he saw the news reports about her disappearance on TV. Naturally, the detectives didn't believe Bridger's story because there were too many inconsistencies. First, there was April's friend who had seen the whole thing. She clearly remembered April talking to the driver and getting into the van with his help, fully conscious, but Bridger insisted he had hit her with his car and let her get in while she was unconscious. So, her version didn't match the eyewitness account. Then there was the whole blackout thing. It seemed far-fetched in itself, but what made it even more suspicious was what the police discovered shortly after April Bridger's disappearance. He had shaved his hair and beard. It seemed a clear attempt to alter his appearance and avoid detection. However, Bridger stuck to his story. When detectives pointed out the inconsistencies, he changed his attitude slightly. Claiming to have been very drunk that day, which in theory could explain his alleged blackout, he also insisted that although he did not remember where he had put April's body, he was sure that she had died in a safe place. No matter how much the investigators pressed him, they could not get the truth out of him, so they shifted their attention to his house. The moment they entered, they were hit by a strong smell of cleaning products. The house was also unpleasantly warm. That's when they noticed the wood-burning stove in the living room. It had clearly been burning for hours. Forensic teams collected the ashes and sent them for analysis. But other than that, there were no obvious clues. No trace of April, no personal effects, nothing. However, when forensic scientists examined more closely, they found traces of blood, and lab results later confirmed it was April's. Next, investigators turned their attention to Bridger's car. If his story about accidentally hitting April with his vehicle was true, there should have been evidence to support it. But there wasn't. There was no blood inside the car, no exterior damage, nothing to suggest an accident. Once again, his version of events didn't add up. Then came the results of the analysis of the ashes in the fireplace. Forensic experts found 17 human bone fragments, all belonging to April. Another bone fragment was also found in the bathroom drain. This confirmed the heartbreaking truth. April was no longer alive. But detectives didn't believe Bridger had succeeded in completely destroying her. Her remains. It was much more likely that she had taken what was left and hidden it somewhere. So, despite the grisly discovery, the police continued their search, determined to find what was left. The news that April was most likely dead shook the community. Until then, people had hoped she would be found alive. Now the focus of the search had shifted. Hundreds of volunteers and police officers were no longer looking for a missing girl, but her remains so that her family could bury her. By then, the search operation had become something massive. In fact, it went down in history as the largest in the country's modern history. Along with local volunteers, hundreds of professionals from various emergency services joined in. They scoured the most rugged terrain, rivers, forests, lakes, determined to find any trace of April. Meanwhile, investigators continued digging for evidence linking Bridger to the crime. When they examined his computer, they found something truly disturbing. It was filled with illegal content involving minors. Even more disgusting, he had saved photos of victims from other high-profile cases. In addition, they found dozens of images of local children, including April and her older sister. It appeared he had downloaded their photos from social media. Then, investigators discovered something even more disturbing. April's older sister revealed that just a few months before the abduction, Bridger had sent her a friend request on social media. She had mentioned it to their father, who immediately recognized the name. He had known Bridger since the early 1990s, but he had lost contact over the years. The request struck him as odd, because Bridger, a grown man, would have wanted to have a connection with his teenage daughter. Trusting his instincts, he told her not to accept it. It's also worth remembering that Bridger was a father himself. He had 6 children with 4 different women. Yet, at the time of April's disappearance, he was living alone. The police discovered a disturbing pattern. Bridger often had relationships with women who had young children. Given the horrific evidence found on his computer, this detail took on a whole new level of importance and only made detectives even more convinced they were dealing with a predator. As police delved deeper into Bridger's past, they discovered that he never stayed focused on any one job for long, constantly switching between different lines of work. He also had a habit of making up stories about himself. He told some people that he had served in the military and even had to change his identity for security reasons. But it was a complete lie. What made it even stranger was that he repeated this claim during police interrogations. He insisted that he had served his country, that he was a good person, and that he would never do such a thing on purpose. Between this and his strange claims about April's death, detectives began to realize they were likely dealing with a pathological liar. No matter how many times his stories turned out to be false, he just kept repeating them. They also discovered something else that supported this theory. Bridger had told everyone he knew that his parents were dead, but in reality they were alive and well. Another interesting detail was that Bridger had broken up with his girlfriend a few days before April's kidnapping. People who knew him said he didn't take it well at all. He started drinking heavily, and that only made him worse. As the police continued to comb through his computer, they found something even more disturbing. Just hours before April disappeared, Richard had texted 3 different women asking to meet, but they had all declined. He then opened and viewed some illegal content from his disgusting collection. At this point, his guilt seemed undeniable. But there was still a big problem. April's remains were nowhere to be found. Desperate for answers, investigators repeatedly turned to the public, hoping that someone had seen Bridger or his car that night. Any small clue could help them retrace his steps and finally figure out what he did with April's body. Finally, a witness came forward with an interesting lead. He reported seeing Bridger the morning after April's abduction, around 9 a.m. The man was walking along the riverbank with a black bag. Investigators also discovered that. Shortly afterward, Bridger had taken his car to a repair shop. The mechanics remembered him well because he had been acting strangely. By then, everyone in town knew about April's disappearance, and emotions were running high. But Bridger spoke about the case as if he were a grieving parent. He was on the verge of tears, speaking as if the missing child were his own. His reactions stuck with the operators. She was overly emotional, almost theatrical, and something just wasn't right. Following this new lead, search parties concentrated their efforts along the river, hoping to find some sign of April. But no matter how thoroughly they searched the area, they still found nothing. Realizing that April's body might never be recovered, detectives made a difficult decision. They charged Bridger with murder, based on the overwhelming evidence they already had. With April's blood found inside Bridger's house, the police pieced together the facts. Their theory was that Bridger had lured April into his car under some pretext, then taken her to his house, committed an assault, and killed her. After that, he began disposing of her body. Investigators discovered that Bridger had previously worked in a slaughterhouse. They suspected he may have used those skills to dispose of the body before burning parts of her remains in the fireplace. But forensic experts agreed that there was no way he could have gotten rid of everything, which meant some of it must have been hidden somewhere else. As the case progressed, Bridger was remanded in prison to await trial, which would begin in a few months. Meanwhile, the search teams had no intention of giving up. Despite worsening weather conditions and the exhaustion of the trails, they continued searching, hoping to find April's remains. The prosecution was confident they could secure a conviction even without a body, but they still refused to give up the search. In total, search parties combed 60 square kilometers, or 37 square miles, examining every possible spot where April's remains might have been hidden. But they found nothing. In the end, April's parents had no choice but to bury only the small fragments they recovered from Bridger's house. To honor her memory, they also placed some of her personal belongings inside the coffin. Hundreds of people attended her funeral, many of them traveling from other towns just to say goodbye. During the search, April had become like family to an entire community. And now they had to let her go. In January 2013, 3 months after April's murder, Bridger appeared in court and pleaded not guilty to murder. At the same time, however, he admitted that he was likely responsible for her death. During the trial, he stuck to his version of events, claiming he accidentally hit April with his car, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. He also insisted he couldn't remember where he hid her remains. Yet, Bridger continued to portray himself as the good guy, saying he only wanted to help April after the so-called incident. The trial lasted until the end of May, and the jury eventually found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a rather rare sentence in the UK. After the trial, Bridger was transferred to a new prison where he was attacked by another inmate. He stabbed him several times with a dagger, but the wounds were not fatal. 4 years after his conviction, investigators continued to contact Bridger, hoping he would tell them where April's remains were. But he never hesitated, just kept insisting that he didn't remember anything. Then, out of nowhere, the police got a tip from another inmate. According to him, Bridger had confessed, saying he had thrown April's remains into the river near his home. But investigators weren't convinced. If a bag containing human remains had been thrown into the water, it would likely have resurfaced. And since search teams had carefully searched the river for miles, it seemed highly unlikely that Bridger was telling the truth. A year after his conviction, the local government purchased Bridger's home and in November 2014 decided to demolish it. Hundreds of locals, including April's parents, gathered to watch as the house was demolished, right on the spot where it had been taken from them. In 2018, April's family faced another harrowing experience. Her father became seriously ill and suffered from partial memory loss. When he regained consciousness, he began asking his wife why April hadn't come to visit him in the hospital. And so, she had to break the news to him again, telling him that their daughter was gone. In a cruel twist of fate, he was forced to relive the pain of losing April a second time. As for the search for her remains, it hasn't resumed since 2013. Police have said they're willing to resume the search if new information comes in, but so far there's been no progress. It's been more than 12 years since April was abducted, and investigators admit the chances of finding her are slim to none. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thanks for watching. A young woman set off for an art show in another city and vanished without a trace. When police got involved, they uncovered a few disturbing clues, but none of them brought them any closer to the truth. The case remained unsolved for nearly 50 years until detectives finally uncovered an unexpected truth that shocked everyone. Mary Kathleen Schleas was born on November 11, 1949, in Champlin, Minnesota. She grew up in a large family, and from a young age, she had a real passion for art. Mary loved drawing, and by the time she reached high school, she already knew that art was what she wanted to dedicate her life to. She went on to study fine arts at the University of Minnesota, focusing on both painting and sculpture. Her teachers immediately recognized her talent. They saw something truly special in Mary and believed she had a bright future ahead of her. Mary even earned several scholarships and eventually graduated with honors. Her work was featured in a bunch of exhibitions, which was a pretty big deal for her back then. She also studied abroad for a while, picked up fluent German and Danish, and even started learning Japanese. After graduating, Mary kept chasing her passion and traveled whenever she could. Since painting didn't really bring in much money, she lived simply and tried to save where she could. She shared an apartment with a friend, and when she needed to get from one city to another, or even to a different state, she usually hitchhiked. Back then, hitchhiking was actually a pretty common way to get around. Public transportation wasn't all that reliable, and if you didn't own a car, getting to another city could be a real challenge. Buses were few and far between, especially in smaller towns. Plus, in the 70s, hitchhiking didn't carry the same dark reputation it does now. Stories about people going missing or getting attacked didn't spread as quickly as they do today, so most folks didn't think twice about it. On February 15, 1974, Mary was 25 years old and planning a trip to an art show in Chicago. The journey from Minneapolis was around 400 miles, so she wasn't planning to do it all in one go. Her idea was to hitchhike to a city called Madison in Wisconsin first, then make her way to Chicago from there. Around 10:30 that morning, she left home carrying a sign that said, Madison, and headed toward the highway. About 3 hours later, a man named Dennis was driving along a rural road in neighboring Wisconsin. At some point, he turned onto a long dead-end road and noticed a parked car with two people standing next to it, a man and a woman. As he drove past, it looked like they might have been arguing or even fighting, but Dennis wasn't totally sure what he was seeing. He kept driving, but the scene kept nagging at him. A few minutes later, he reached the end of the road, turned around, and headed back. But by the time he got there, the car was gone. Still, something in the snow caught his eye, and that's when he realized there was someone lying by the side of the road. Dennis didn't get out of his car. Instead, he rushed home and told his wife what he'd seen. Then, he asked his neighbor to go with him, and the two of them headed back to the spot together. When they arrived, it was clear that what Dennis saw really was a person. It was a young woman, and there was blood on her clothes. They immediately drove to the nearest house and called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they confirmed that the young woman was already dead. She had multiple stab wounds, but something didn't add up. There wasn't much blood in the snow, which suggested she'd been killed somewhere else and left there afterward. Not far from the body, police found a man's hat, which they believed might have belonged to the killer. Crime scene techs also tried to make casts of some tire tracks nearby, but the snow made it impossible for the casting material to set properly. There were no other clues to go on, so the body was sent off to the medical examiner for further investigation. In the meantime, police spoke with the only witness they had, Dennis, hoping he could give them something to work with. Based on Dennis' statement, he'd seen a white, slim-built man, probably between 25 and 35 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches tall with light brown hair. As for the car, it was a small, gold-colored sedan, but Dennis didn't catch the model or license plate. Meanwhile, the medical examiner determined that the victim had been stabbed around 15 times and died from blood loss. There were also several defensive wounds on her arms, which showed she had tried to fight off her attacker. However, there were no signs of sexual assault, which ruled out the most obvious motive. As they continued working on the case, the coroner was finally able to identify the victim. It was Mary. After speaking with Mary's roommate, police learned she had been planning to attend an art show in another city. The roommate also mentioned that Mary had taken her purse with her, but it was nowhere to be found at the crime scene. Knowing that she left the house around 10:30 a.m. and that her body was discovered roughly 3 hours later, detectives were able to piece together a rough timeline. The drive from her home to where her body was found would have taken about an hour and a half, meaning it was very likely that the person who picked her up in Minneapolis was the one who killed her. Police put together a composite sketch of the suspect based on Dennis' description and shared it with the local newspapers, hoping someone might recognize him. A few tips did come in, but none of them brought investigators any closer to finding the killer. At the same time, detectives started to wonder if Dennis himself might have been involved, and they had a few reasons to think so. They knew for a fact that he was on a remote dead-end road, and no one else had seen the other man he described. Some parts of his story also didn't exactly add up. Dennis claimed he'd gone to the store that day, and on the way back, he decided to keep driving for a while. When asked why, his explanation was unusual. He said his dog was with him in the car and he thought she wanted to go for a longer ride. The reason raised more than a few eyebrows, especially since Dennis had taken a turn onto a dead-end road that hardly anyone ever used. Another thing that raised suspicion was Dennis' behavior. When he found the body, he didn't get out of his car. Instead, he drove all the way home to bring his neighbor back with him. While he was home, he didn't even bother calling the police. That only happened after his neighbor saw the body for himself. To investigators, it looked like Dennis might have been trying to stage an alibi or at least distance himself from the crime. But there were also a few things that pointed away from him being involved. For one, there were tire tracks on that road that didn't match his car. Still, detectives couldn't rule out the possibility that another vehicle had simply passed through before the murder. Police also couldn't find any evidence that Dennis had been in Minneapolis that morning, which meant he likely couldn't have picked Mary up in the first place. But even that wasn't a sure thing. It was still possible that Mary got a ride from someone else first and then ended up in Dennis' car later. Police kept pressing Dennis for answers, but he stuck to his story. At one point, they even brought in a hypnotist to try and unlock any buried memories or hidden details. He tried twice, but both times it didn't work. Interestingly, one of the tips police received was an anonymous letter urging them to take a closer look at Dennis as a potential suspect. However, the letter didn't include any new information or evidence, just a vague warning. With no progress being made on that front, investigators started looking for any other possible leads. That's when they stumbled across an unsolved case from 2 years earlier, and it immediately caught their attention. Back in 1972, a young woman named Jolly from Minneapolis decided to hitchhike home, and 15 hours later, her body was found near a river on the outskirts of the city. Detectives started looking into a possible connection between her case and Mary's, since there were some clear similarities. Jolly's friends had seen her getting into a gold-colored car driven by a young man. And just like with Mary, the medical examiner found no signs of sexual assault. But despite how similar the two cases seemed, the investigation into Jolly's murder hadn't led anywhere either. There were no solid leads and nothing to go on. Investigators tried to find any thread linking the two cases that might point them to the suspect, but every lead ended up going nowhere. Over the next few months, detectives looked into a number of potential suspects, but none of them could be linked to Mary's murder. They also found a few witnesses who claimed they'd seen a man matching the composite sketch, driving a gold-colored sedan, but once again, it didn't lead anywhere. Eventually, the case went cold. Investigators just couldn't find a single new lead to move things forward. In the years that followed, the case was reopened several times, but each time it hit the same dead end. In the early 1980s, police came up with a theory that Mary's killer might have been a serial murderer named Randall Woodfield. He had confessed to killing 44 people and was serving a life sentence. Most of his victims were picked up while hitchhiking, which made him a logical suspect in Mary's case. But despite the similarities, detectives were never able to find any concrete link between him and the murder. In the following years, investigators followed up on hundreds of leads that took them across nearly every U.S. state and even into Canada. But still, they couldn't figure out who had killed Mary. Over time, Mary's murder became something of a local legend, especially in the county where her body was found. People started reporting strange sightings of a young woman walking along the roadside, trying to hitch a ride. But as soon as they looked away, she vanished without a trace. 2 fishermen claimed they saw a similar-looking woman near a lake. They said she was glowing with a soft white light and just stood there in silence, watching them from a distance. Later on, a local woman came forward saying that a murdered woman named Mary regularly visited her and spoke to her. Since the case was never solved, those paranormal stories eventually became far more well-known than the actual crime. Many people didn't even realize that behind the ghost stories was a very real tragedy. In the early 2000s, as DNA analysis became a standard tool in criminal investigations, detectives decided to take another shot at finding a genetic trace of Mary's killer. Back in 1974, the medical examiners had found traces of blood and skin under Mary's fingernails, likely from the attacker. The evidence was still sitting in storage, but unfortunately, experts weren't able to extract a usable DNA profile from it. But there was still one more lead. Remember the hat found near the crime scene? It had been kept in evidence all these years, and inside were a few short strands of male hair. Forensic experts tested them and managed to pull a partial DNA profile. But once again, they hit a wall. There were no matches in the FBI's database. Still, it wasn't all for nothing. That DNA was enough to rule out several suspects, including the serial killer they'd once suspected, since his DNA had long been on file. The case remained cold for several more years, until late 2022, when detectives learned about a new DNA technique called genetic genealogy. Realizing this might be their last real chance to solve Mary's murder, they reached out to a college lab in New Jersey that specialized in this kind of research, and the lab agreed to help. The experts got to work using the partial DNA profile taken from the hair inside the hat. The fact that it wasn't a full profile made things much harder, but after a long process of combing through public genealogy databases and building out possible family trees, they eventually landed on a potential suspect, a man who matched all the necessary criteria. All that was left was to get a DNA sample from him. Detectives tracked him down and asked if he'd be willing to provide one, and he agreed. But to their surprise, the DNA didn't match. Then the analysts suggested another possibility. Maybe the killer was his first cousin. Detectives followed that lead and collected a second DNA sample, but once again, no match. The whole situation was baffling. Both of those men were clearly close biological relatives of the killer. That much was certain. But there wasn't anyone else in their family who could possibly be the suspect. That's when experts suggested a new theory. What if the killer had been adopted? That would explain why he didn't show up anywhere in the known family tree. The team began digging through old records to investigate that possibility, and on November 4, 2024, they finally found what they'd been looking for. Based on everything they uncovered, there was a strong chance that the biological relative they'd been searching for was an 84-year-old man named John Miller. Detectives started looking into Miller's background and discovered that he had a daughter. They reached out to her and she agreed to provide a DNA sample. When the results came back, it was exactly what detectives had been hoping for. The hair found in the hat at the crime scene belonged to her father. And just like that, 50 years after Mary's murder, investigators finally uncovered the identity of her killer. As soon as the lab confirmed the DNA match, detectives went straight to his home. Almost immediately after they told him about the DNA evidence, John Miller calmly confessed. He said that on the day of the murder, he picked up Mary on the side of the road and promised to give her a ride to her destination. But once they got out of the city, he started pressuring her for sex. When she refused, Miller pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times. Then he drove down that remote dead-end road, planning to bury her body in the snow. While he was dragging her out of the car, a man drove by. Panicked, he jumped back in his vehicle and sped off, leaving the body lying by the roadside. The next day, he saw a newspaper article about the murder and felt relieved. The witness, it turned out, had gotten the color of his car wrong. According to Miller, he was driving a light blue car at the time, not a gold one. In the end, he said he didn't feel much of anything about what he'd done and had barely thought about it since. Miller also told detectives that he had tossed the murder weapon into a swamp near his home, though he couldn't remember what he did with Mary's purse. When asked if he had killed anyone else, Miller said no. He claimed he didn't even really understand why he had killed Mary in the first place. After his confession, he was officially charged with murder and taken into custody to await trial. But Miller made it clear he had no intention of fighting the charges. He said he would plead guilty because he didn't want to go through a long court process. As far as he was concerned, he was ready to spend the rest of his life in prison. So, in the end, detectives were finally able to solve this complicated case, even if it took 5 decades to get there. Despite the fact that Miller is now nearly 85 years old and unlikely to spend many more years behind bars, the case of Mary Schleas has finally been closed. As for Jolly's murder, Miller's involvement now seems unlikely. Given that he was driving a completely different colored car back then, it's very possible he had nothing to do with that crime. Still, investigators are looking into whether he might be connected to any other unsolved cases. But so far, they haven't found anything to tie him to any additional murders. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. Hi guys, my name is Brandon and today we'll delve into the case of a girl who disappeared on her way home from school. The police and thousands of volunteers went on a search, but they couldn't find any traces of her. This went on for several days until an extremely unexpected twist brought closure to this case, making it one of the most shocking stories in the country. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992, in Vallejo, California. She grew up in a large, close-knit family with 2 brothers and a sister. Mitzi was a cheerful and bright child. She enjoyed spending time outdoors with her friends and playing with her siblings. From a young age, Mitzi was quite independent. When she started elementary school, her parents allowed her to walk there with her brother without any adult supervision. The school was located just a short distance from their home, with most of the route lying along a busy road. August 10, 2000, was Mitzi's 8th birthday. She was excited about the celebration party her family had been preparing for her. Mitzi asked her mom if she could skip school for the occasion, but the woman said no. Mitzi was upset about it, and around 7:30 a.m., she left her home with her brother. After her classes, Mitzi was supposed to wait for her brother so they could walk home together. But when her brother went outside the school, he couldn't find his sister anywhere. Thinking she had already left without him, he headed home alone. But it turned out that Mitzi wasn't there. Their older sister, who was home at that time, immediately became worried. Since Mitzi was eagerly anticipating her birthday party, her absence seemed odd. She waited for some time, hoping that Mitzi would eventually show up, and around 4 p.m., the sister decided to call their mom and tell her about it. Their mom immediately called Mitzi's school and learned that her daughter had attended all her classes. The mother then reached out to family members and Mitzi's friends, but no one had seen her after school. Mitzi's relatives became worried and started searching for her. Many people, from family friends to neighbors, also joined in. Together, they quickly organized a massive search. While some of them walked the streets, others knocked on every door along the route, from the house to school, asking if anyone had seen her. They even started printing and distributing flyers with information about Mitzi. Despite all their efforts, they couldn't find her, so Mitzi's parents decided to call 911. The police immediately joined the search, and local media started covering the case on the same day. Mitzi's disappearance instantly captured the public's attention, since similar incidents had already occurred in their town before. For several years, an unknown perpetrator or multiple perpetrators had been kidnapping kids in Vallejo. The most recent case had occurred in December '99, less than a year before Mitzi's disappearance. 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, who lived just a few miles from Mitzi's house, disappeared on her way to school. Despite all the efforts by the police and the FBI, she was never found. Now, when Mitzi vanished on her way home from school, investigators feared the same perpetrator might be involved. Despite the lack of leads at that point, the striking similarities between those cases were already obvious. However, Ziana's case remained unsolved, leaving detectives with little to go on. They began re-examining everyone previously considered a suspect in her case, but it yielded no results. The next day, Mitzi's disappearance made headlines not only in the local news, but statewide. Everyone feared a serial kidnapper was at large and dreaded the possibility of him getting away with it once again. Mitzi's relatives gave multiple interviews, trying to draw more attention to the case. Her mom also pleaded with the possible abductor to return her daughter safely. The police received numerous tips, but none of them proved useful. However, everything changed 24 hours after Mitzi's disappearance when something unexpected happened. A man contacted the police, informing them that he discovered bloodied rags at a landfill. Upon examination, experts determined that the rags were actually bedsheets from a Vallejo hotel. Although they sent the evidence to the lab, blood analysis would take days. Investigators also visited the hotel, but were unable to confirm whether Mitzi had been there. With nothing but waiting for lab results, investigators combed the landfill, searching for any other clues, but it yielded nothing. The following day, August 12th, the police received another call and it changed the course of this case immediately. At around 11 a.m., a man reported driving through an industrial area in Santa Clara when a little girl ran up to his van, screaming that someone was chasing her. She climbed into the van's cabin and the driver saw a man running in their direction. The girl yelled that he had kidnapped her and wanted to kill her. As soon as she was in the van, the perpetrator turned around, got into his car and fled. Meanwhile, the girl told the driver her name was Mitzi Sanchez and he contacted the police. Officers immediately picked her up and drove her to a hospital for examination. They also called her mother and let her speak to her daughter. Soon after, her relatives rushed to the hospital and reunited with Mitzi. Meanwhile, detectives spoke with the van driver. The man proved a crucial lead. He remembered the license plate of the kidnapper's vehicle because it drove off right in front of his van. It turned out the van driver was on that road almost by chance. He had a day off, but was asked by his supervisor to cover a shift and deliver a load. If he hadn't been there, the perpetrator possibly could have caught up with the girl. The police ran the license plate and identified the car belonging to a 39-year-old man named Curtis Dean Anderson. He had been on law enforcement's radar before, with prior convictions for thefts, kidnapping, and suspicion of other crimes. As investigators focused all efforts on finding the abductor, their colleagues prepared to hear Mitzi's account of what had happened to her. She told them that on August 10th, she was eagerly awaiting the end of school to go home and celebrate her birthday with her family. When her final class ended, Mitzi decided not to wait for her brother and headed home alone. Just a few hundred yards away, she noticed a parked car by the roadside. Inside was a man, watching her intently through the rearview mirror. Mitzi felt uneasy about him, but quickly brushed it off. It was daytime, she was on a familiar street, and being young, she didn't fully grasp the potential danger posed by strangers. As Mitzi approached the car, the man got out and asked her to help him. He said he needed to grab a roll of tape from under the car seat. He also explained that he couldn't bend down himself due to a leg injury from falling off his bike. Despite her uneasy feeling, Mitzi agreed to help. At that time, she couldn't fully comprehend the potential danger posed by the adult man, and her parents had always taught her to help others. As soon as Mitzi reached for the tape, the perpetrator shoved her inside, covered her mouth with his hand, and slammed the door shut. Mitzi tried to scream, but it was too late. The kidnapper drove off in an unknown direction, leaving her to gaze out the window in horror. At one point, they passed Mitzi's home, and she saw her relatives preparing to celebrate her birthday. A few minutes later, the kidnapper pulled into a deserted parking lot. He gave Mitzi new clothes, forced her to change, and discarded her old clothing in a nearby trash bin. He also warned Mitzi not to try to escape, claiming he had a gun and that no one ever managed to get away from him. In the next few hours, he drove Mitzi in an unknown direction. At one point, she asked why he had kidnapped her, and the man simply replied that the same had happened to him when he was a child. When it got dark, he parked again and began covering the car windows with some rags. He then pulled out a chain and secured it to Mitzi's leg with a padlock. Then, the perpetrator took out a bottle of alcohol and forced her to take a few sips. Mitzi tried to argue with him, but eventually complied with his demand. After that, the man grabbed a camera and took several pictures of Mitzi, then laid down to sleep right in the car. Mitzi tried to keep her eyes open, afraid of falling asleep. She was thinking how to escape, and at one point saw a police car drive past the parking lot, but it was far away, and even if Mitzi had screamed, the officers would never have been able to hear her. The next day, the perpetrator continued driving her around the city. He made her sit on the floor of the car and covered her with sheets to hide her from view. At one point, he stopped and got out for a few minutes. Mitzi tried to free her leg from the chain but quickly realized it was impossible. She also found a nail file and attempted to unlock the padlock, but it didn't work. When the perpetrator returned to the car and drove away, he claimed he had stopped by her parents' house. The kidnapper pretended to be a concerned citizen and asked for flyers to distribute around town. Mitzi was shocked and overwhelmed. She had been so close to home, yet still remained in captivity. Throughout the next few hours, the perpetrator stopped several times, getting in and out of the car. In the evening, he drove out of town and parked in a deserted area where he sexually assaulted his victim. After that, the man fell asleep, leaving Mitzi in a state of shock. The next morning, he drove off again, making several stops along the way, mainly to buy cigarettes and alcohol. At one point, when he returned to the car and leaned into the cabin, something fell out of his pocket. He told Mitzi not to look there and left again. But the girl didn't listen to him. She glanced down and saw a large bunch of keys. Mitzi quickly realized that one of them must unlock the padlock on her chain. She was afraid of what the perpetrator might do to her if she disobeyed, but eventually, Mitzi overcame this fear. She grabbed the bunch, picked a key that seemed to fit the lock the best, and attempted to unlock it. To her surprise, it worked. Mitzi freed herself from the chain. Now, only the car door stood between her and freedom. Mitzi opened the window and tried to climb out through it, but she encountered another problem. She was so exhausted that she could barely move her legs. Gathering all her strength, she managed to lift herself and leap out of the car. As she crawled around it, she spotted her kidnapper, who immediately noticed her. The man began shouting for her to come back, but Mitzi had no intention of giving up. With her last ounce of energy, she ran in the opposite direction. The perpetrator chased after her while Mitzi tried to flag down passing cars for help. She waved and screamed, but they all drove past. Despite this, Mitzi kept moving toward her freedom. She had no doubt that if she stopped for even a second, the perpetrator would catch up and harm her. Everything happened very quickly, but for Mitzi, this moment stretched on forever. Eventually, she spotted a van, ran towards it, and jumped right in front of it. The driver quickly stopped and Mitzi climbed into the cabin. She was shocked, dehydrated, and hungry, but her life was no longer in danger. At the hospital, doctors provided her with the necessary assistance, and soon, her entire family arrived to reunite with her. Mitzi's miraculous rescue instantly became the main news story in the city. When she was brought home, thousands of people gathered on her street. They applauded her and shouted birthday greetings, which she had missed. Meanwhile, the police were hunting down the kidnapper, whose whereabouts remained unknown. When they showed his photo to Mitzi's mother, she realized she had actually seen him twice. The first time was before her daughter's abduction, when he stood on their street and looked towards their house. The second time was the day after Mitzi's disappearance, when the perpetrator came to her home and asked for flyers. The search for Curtis continued until late evening. Police set up surveillance at all known places he frequented, and eventually it paid off. He came to a trailer park and was apprehended without resistance. Curtis was booked in jail awaiting trial, and detectives began investigating his possible connections to other crimes. The man himself told Mitzi she wasn't his first victim and no one had managed to escape him. Investigators simply couldn't imagine this being his first crime of its kind. All his careful and likely premeditated actions suggested he had significant experience in committing such atrocities. It's worth mentioning that Curtis had been previously imprisoned for kidnapping a woman in 1991. He was released in November 1999, and now the police were confident that after his release, he had killed at least one girl, 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, but we'll get back to that shortly. There was also no doubt that he intended to kill Mitzi. Moreover, one specific fact directly indicated that it was supposed to happen on the day of her escape. Police learned why Curtis had stopped in the industrial area. He used to work there at one of the companies, and that day he visited his former colleagues. He had asked them for a large bag, and detectives immediately realized he planned to dispose of a body in it. After Curtis's arrest, Mitzi struggled to recover for a long time. However, she soon learned that the police were suspecting him of kidnapping Ziana, which made her even more uneasy. While Mitzi was glad she managed to escape, she also worried about the fate of this 7-year-old girl. More than 8 months have passed since her disappearance, and there was no news about Ziana's fate. Mitzi wanted to help find her, so just days after her own rescue, she participated in a search operation along with other volunteers. Unfortunately, they couldn't find any new leads on Ziana's possible whereabouts. This continued until January 2001, when a human skull was found in the mountains near the city of Santa Cruz. Forensic analysis showed it belonged to Ziana, and she was officially declared dead. Mitzi took this news very hard, but ahead of her was another challenge: the trial. It began in April of the same year. Mitzi had to testify before the full courtroom and recount in every detail what Curtis had done to her. He was also present there, but despite all of this, Mitzi managed to fulfill her task. In the end, Curtis was sentenced to 251 years in prison, but that wasn't the end of his story. Detectives repeatedly visited him in jail and asked him questions about his possible involvement in other crimes. At one point, they learned that Curtis had confessed to a fellow inmate about kidnapping and killing 8 other girls. The inmate agreed to cooperate with the police and repeated Curtis' words in detail. But Curtis himself wasn't ready to reveal all his secrets. He didn't deny anything, but tried to negotiate various privileges for himself, speaking with detectives in riddles. Eventually, the man hinted that he had indeed murdered Ziana Fairchild and that he had killed at least 13 other girls and women. It wasn't until 2005 that he gave full confession in Ziana's murder, and for that, he received an additional 50-year sentence. As for Mitzi, her challenges didn't end with Curtis' trial. Just a few weeks after her rescue, she returned to school where she faced bullying from other children. They called her the kidnapped girl, said she should have died instead of being saved, and generally behaved extremely inappropriately. As a result, her school years became a heavy burden for her, and along with the tragedy she had experienced, it didn't help in her recovery process. Mitzi also repeatedly joined the searches for other missing children, but more often than not, it ended with the discovery of their bodies. Each time, she felt this tragedy as if it were her own, and ultimately, she couldn't cope with this pressure anymore. Alcohol became her only way to cope with the stress, and with each passing day, Mitzi turned to it more and more frequently. Eventually, she stopped seeing even the slightest chance of returning to a normal life. But one day, everything changed. Mitzi was involved in a serious car accident after a party with friends. She broke her neck, arm, and spent 2 weeks in a coma. When she woke up, doctors informed her that she is pregnant and would have a daughter. This news turned her life upside down, and Mitzi found the strength to change it for the better once again. She decided to dedicate all her time not only to her daughter, but also to other children who became victims of various crimes. She founded a non-profit organization that continues to provide assistance to those in need to this day. As for Curtis, he died of illness in 2007, just 6 years after being sentenced. The only reason the detectives regretted it was the fact that they had not managed to obtain full confessions from him regarding other cases he was suspected of. Although they still haven't been solved, the police continue to consider his involvement highly probable. It is worth mentioning that Curtis had a son who followed in his father's footsteps. He was convicted of murder, and in 2019, his own life ended in prison. Alright guys, share your thoughts on the story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. A student finished her shift and vanished during a phone call with her boyfriend under bizarre circumstances. The police quickly launched a search, combing through hours of surveillance footage, hoping to find any clues. Soon, they came across something truly chilling, but the young woman's fate remained a mystery for months. Eventually, investigators uncovered the truth, but the outcome of the case sparked widespread outrage and disbelief. Drew Sheedin was born on September 26, 1981, in the small town of Pequea Lakes, Minnesota. From an early age, Drew was full of energy and determination. She loved drawing, crafting, and keeping active with basketball, volleyball, and golf. She was also involved in various charity programs, always looking for ways to help anyone in need. Her warm personality and genuine kindness made her a lot of friends, and in high school, she was even voted prom queen. After graduating, Drew enrolled at the University of North Dakota, where she majored in fine arts. Even though the campus was a 3-hour drive from her hometown, she tried to visit her parents as often as she could. Drew managed to juggle her studies where she excelled, 2 part-time jobs, and an active role in campus life. She also continued to dedicate her time to charity, never losing sight of what mattered most to her. On top of that, Drew signed up for a special university program that gave her the chance to travel on a regular basis, and she was especially excited about her upcoming trip to Australia. While in college, Drew started dating a guy named Chris. The two quickly became serious and began making big plans for their future together. On November 22, 2003, 22-year-old Drew headed out for her usual weekend shift at a clothing store where she worked part-time. Later that evening, she was scheduled to work as a waitress at a local club. After finishing her first shift, Drew stopped by a shop in the same mall, bought herself a purse, and walked toward the parking lot. On the way, she called her boyfriend, Chris, and they chatted for about 4 minutes. But then, something strange happened. Drew suddenly went silent in the middle of the conversation. After a pause, she said, "Oh my God." Then the line went dead. At first, Chris didn't think much of it. He assumed the call had dropped as Drew walked through the parking lot or that her phone battery had died. 3 hours later, Chris received another call from Drew's phone. But when he answered, all he could hear was silence. There was a faint noise in the background, something that sounded like wind, along with what seemed to be the sound of phone buttons being pressed. He called out Drew's name several times, but there was no response. Chris tried calling her back, but Drew didn't answer. This time, he started to worry. He decided to call her roommate to see if she had heard from Drew. The roommate said she hadn't spoken to her all day, but reassured him, saying Drew was probably just busy with work and there was no need to panic. Shortly after the conversation, though, Drew's roommate got a call from the manager at the club where Drew was supposed to work that evening. To her surprise, the manager said Drew hadn't shown up for her shift and she hadn't even called to let anyone know. This was completely out of character for Drew as she was always responsible and reliable. Her roommate, recalling the strange call Chris had mentioned, began to worry that something bad might have happened. She started calling local hospitals, thinking Drew might have been admitted somewhere, but no one matching her description had been brought in. By then, it was late in the evening, and the roommate decided it was time to contact the police. She explained that Drew had missed her shift, didn't come home, and had some unsettling phone calls with her boyfriend. But the police didn't see any immediate cause for alarm. To them, there wasn't enough evidence to suggest something serious had happened. After all, Drew was 22, so they just recommended waiting a little longer before taking any action. Still, Drew's roommate decided to take matters into her own hands and reached out to the University of North Dakota's campus police. Unlike the city police, they jumped right into action. Their first stop was the mall where Drew had worked that day. It was the last place anyone had seen or heard from her. When they checked the parking lot, they found her car still in its usual spot, even though her shift had ended hours ago. Another weird thing was the fact that the car doors were unlocked. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle or anything to indicate that something bad had happened. But then the officers noticed something really suspicious. Lying on the ground near the car was a small knife sheath. This discovery raised serious concerns, prompting the university police to contact the city police, who finally stepped in. Officers requested CCTV footage from the parking lot, hoping for a lead. But there was a problem. Drew's car was parked in a blind spot, completely out of the camera's view. Determined to figure out what happened, investigators turned to the mall's security footage. They started combing through hours of video from every camera inside the building, trying to trace Drew's movements before she vanished. It was quite a challenge given the size of the mall, so the process was anything but quick. Meanwhile, news of Drew's disappearance quickly spread across campus. The university wasted no time organizing a massive search effort. Hundreds of students stepped up to help, scouring streets, wooded trails, riverbanks, and other secluded areas. The faculty also urged anyone with information to come forward, hoping for a clue that could shed light on what had happened to Drew. Meanwhile, the police got hold of Drew's phone records, which backed up her boyfriend's story about their last call. But when they dug into the phone's location data, they found something odd. The cell tower pings showed that Drew's final call to Chris hadn't come from the mall parking lot. Instead, it had been made from a nearby town, about a 30-minute drive away. Based on the timeline, investigators realized that the noises Chris heard during the call, like the sound of wind and buttons being pressed, could have occurred while Drew was already in this other location. Since her car was still parked at the mall, it was clear Drew couldn't have gotten to another town on her own. This led police to suspect that she may have been abducted. But despite their extensive efforts, the next few days passed without any new leads. Officers kept combing through the mall's surveillance footage while search teams scoured the city, desperately hoping to find even the smallest clue. 2 days later, the case finally took a turn. In a small town called Crookston, near the spot where Drew's phone last pinged, police found a black shoe by the riverbank. When they showed it to Drew's roommate, she immediately recognized it. It was one of Drew's. This discovery deepened investigators' fears. If Drew had been abducted, the evidence suggested she'd been taken far from her town. Police quickly contacted other departments in the area, sharing details of the case and asking for their help in the search. Meanwhile, investigators finally found CCTV footage from the mall that showed Drew on the day she disappeared. They saw her visiting several stores after her shift, seemingly shopping for Christmas gifts for her loved ones. This footage gave investigators a clear idea of what Drew was wearing at the time she vanished. It also confirmed that she had been wearing the same black shoes as the one found near the river in the neighboring town. With all the available clips featuring Drew in hand, investigators started analyzing the footage for any suspicious individuals who might have been following her or appeared in multiple frames with her. Before long, one person caught their attention. A middle-aged man dressed in all black, walking with a cane. His unusual behavior stood out immediately. According to the CCTV footage, the man entered the grocery store connected to the mall multiple times. However, he never bought anything. Instead, he appeared to ignore the shelves entirely and focus on other shoppers, particularly women. Investigators soon spotted the same man on other footage taken outside the store. He was sitting on a bench watching passers-by. But then something truly suspicious happened. When a young woman who vaguely resembled Drew walked past him, he got up from the bench and started following her. Over the next few hours, the police uncovered more clips showing the same man following other young women around the mall. Unfortunately, the footage alone didn't give them enough to identify him, so detectives turned to their database, searching through records of men in the area with prior convictions for serious crimes. After compiling a list of 60 names, the investigators narrowed it down to just 4, eliminating anyone who didn't match the suspect's description. From the remaining candidates, they identified one man who bore a striking resemblance to the figure in the mall footage, 50-year-old Alfonso Rodriguez. Rodriguez had an extensive criminal history and a troubled past. He had struggled with severe health issues since childhood, which made school and social interactions, especially with women, extremely challenging. For instance, one of his legs was shorter than the other, forcing him to rely on a cane to walk. Alfonso eventually turned to drugs, and at 21 he had his first run-in with the law. He attempted to assault a woman who had offered him a ride home. Once inside her car, he pulled out a knife and tried to attack her, but the victim managed to fight him off. Not long after, he attacked 2 more women in the same month. He was sentenced to 5 years of mandatory therapy and then released back into the community. That same year, Alfonso was arrested again, this time in suspicion of assault. However, the prosecution couldn't gather enough evidence for a conviction. Shortly after, he attempted to abduct another woman, stabbing her during the attack. This time, he was caught and convicted. Rodriguez was sentenced to 23 years in prison, but was released on May 1, 2003, just 7 months before Drew went missing. What's even more troubling is that he was placed under the supervision of his relatives, who themselves doubted whether he was ready to return to society. Following his release, Alfonso moved in with his mother in Crookston, the very town where Drew's shoe had been discovered. Given all of this, detectives were almost certain Alfonso was connected to Drew's disappearance. On the 4th day of the investigation, they brought him in for questioning. Alfonso admitted he had been at the mall, but insisted he had nothing to do with the abduction. He claimed he was there to watch a movie at the theater inside the mall. He even named a specific film, but when investigators checked his story, they discovered that the movie wasn't playing, not just at that theater, but nowhere in the entire town. Realizing Alfonso had lied, the police asked to search his car. Surprisingly, he agreed without requiring a warrant. Inside, they found a receipt from a store showing he had purchased a pocket knife. When detectives looked into the knife's model, they determined that the sheath found near Drew's car was an exact match. But that wasn't the most alarming discovery. The knife itself was also in Alfonso's car, submerged in a bottle filled with cleaning solution. When forensic experts examined Alfonso's car, they discovered traces of wiped blood. They managed to extract a DNA sample, which was then compared to DNA taken from Drew's toothbrush. It was a perfect match. On top of that, they found a woman's shoe in his car and another knife. This one hadn't been soaked in cleaning solution. When they tested it, they discovered traces of blood on the blade. DNA analysis confirmed it was Drew's. By December 10th, with all the evidence in hand, Alfonso was arrested and charged with kidnapping and suspected murder. However, despite how damning the case against him seemed, detectives still had no idea what had actually happened to Drew or where she was. Alfonso refused to confess, so police focused all their efforts on finding Drew. They appealed to the public for help, brought in even more volunteers, and concentrated their search on Crookston and the surrounding areas. But despite their best efforts, months went by with no results. Heavy snowfall that winter made the situation even worse, as search teams were unable to access remote areas. By early March, 3 months after Drew disappeared, preparations began for Alfonso's trial, and he pleaded not guilty before the judge. At this point, almost no one believed Drew was still alive, but with all the evidence they had, prosecutors were confident they could secure a conviction. Meanwhile, police pressed on with their search. As spring arrived and the snow started to melt, they were finally able to explore previously inaccessible areas, like forests, open fields, and bodies of water. This continued until April 17th, when investigators received the sad but expected news. Drew's body had been found a few miles west of Crookston, submerged in the local river. During the winter, the area had been frozen over and covered in snow, making it nearly impossible for search teams to locate her earlier. But as soon as the snow fully melted, her body was quickly discovered. Medical examiners found bruises, knife wounds, and evidence of SA on her body. As for the cause of death, they couldn't reach a definitive conclusion. Along with the stab wounds, there were signs of strangulation, but there was also a possibility that she died from exposure to the cold after being left in that location. It was determined that Drew had likely died about 3 hours after she was abducted. Now that the police had found Drew's body, the prosecution had one final task: to ensure the killer faced justice. Since the abduction occurred in North Dakota, but the murder took place in neighboring Minnesota, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. This meant Alfonso could face the death penalty, even though capital punishment was banned in both states. Despite this, the governor of Minnesota publicly supported the possibility of a death sentence, though many residents of his state opposed it. In North Dakota, this case was the first in over a century where a resident faced the prospect of the death penalty. The trial began in the summer of 2006, and Alfonso continued maintaining his innocence. But with the overwhelming evidence against him, there was almost no chance of avoiding punishment, and on February 8, 2007, he was sentenced to death. As is often the case with capital punishment, the execution was delayed for years. During this time, Alfonso remained in prison, awaiting his fate. Meanwhile, Drew's family got actively involved in pushing for a law to create a national registry of offenders convicted of violent crimes. In the summer of 2007, this law, named in Drew's memory, was signed by the president. It set up a website where the public could access addresses and other personal information of people convicted of violent offenses. Drew's parents repeatedly said that Alfonso should never have been released from prison in the first place. Later, even the doctor in charge of the mandatory rehab spoke out, telling reporters he had strongly opposed his release. He'd recommended transferring Alfonso from the clinic to prison because he believed Alfonso still posed a danger to society. Despite these warnings, Alfonso was allowed back into the community, a decision that ended in tragedy. Unfortunately for Drew's family, the sentencing of Alfonso Rodriguez didn't mark the end of the case. In 2011, Rodriguez's lawyers filed an appeal, claiming that their client suffered from developmental issues. While this initial attempt failed, a second appeal, filed 10 years later in 2021, was far more successful. This time, the judge ruled in favor of the defense. He acknowledged evidence suggesting Rodriguez did have developmental challenges and noted that his attorneys hadn't been given a fair chance to present these details during the original trial. The judge also highlighted Rodriguez's troubled childhood and significant health problems. The defense team further argued that the medical examiner who testified during the trial had exaggerated the extent of Drew's injuries, suggesting that the truth wasn't as horrific as it had been made to seem. All of this ultimately led to reopening the case, leaving Drew's family to once again fight for justice. In the end, the judge overturned Rodriguez's death sentence and ordered a new trial. As a result, in March 2023, Alfonso was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What's particularly unsettling is that Rodriguez had already confessed to the crime during a 2013 interview from death row. However, now he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, no longer facing the threat of execution. In Drew's memory, her university established a scholarship that remains active to this day. Her family also created a memorial garden in her hometown, and plans are underway to build a similar memorial on her university campus. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A woman left her daughter with a friend for one evening, but when she returned home, she walked into a scene that resembled more of a horror movie than reality. Something terrible had happened in her absence, and the police began their investigation. They found several clues and eerie messages left by the perpetrator, but this mystery remained unsolved for decades. It wasn't until 26 years later, due to an unexpected turn of events, that the case was finally solved. Robin Cornell was born on November 30, 1978, in Florida. She had an older sister and a loving mother, Jen, who raised the girls on her own since their father was not actively involved in their lives. When Robin was 10, they moved to a town called Cape Coral. Jan got a job at a local hospital and found a home just a few minutes' walk from work. Her older daughter had gone off to study and moved out, so it was just Jan and her younger daughter living together. Robin really liked this town. She made friends right away at her new school, joined a few sports teams, and quickly settled into her new environment. In her free time, Robin loved exploring nature with her friends, but most of all, she loved animals. Once, she found an injured bird, took it home, and nursed it back to health until it could fly again. Jan was also happy with the move. She had found a good job and met a man named Donald, and they started dating. Since the birth of her daughters, Jan had devoted all her time to caring for them and working, so she was glad to finally have a chance to build her own personal life. At the hospital, Jan also met a woman named Lisa, and over time, they became best friends. In early May 1990, Jan suggested Lisa move in with them as it was difficult for Lisa to afford renting a place on her own. Jan was also happy to share the rent and they had plenty of space. Their complex consisted of two-story townhouses and there was a spare room for Lisa. Eventually, Lisa moved in. She immediately got along with Robin, who was 11 at the time, and even agreed to babysit her when Jan was at work. On the evening of May 9th, a week after Lisa moved in with them, Jan planned to visit Donald to watch a game together. At first, she thought about canceling these plans because she felt uneasy asking Lisa to watch Robin for the entire evening. But Lisa reassured her that it was no trouble at all and she would be happy to spend time with her. So, Jan went to Donald's house, leaving Robin with Lisa. She planned to return in a few hours as she had to work an early shift at the hospital the next morning. However, she accidentally fell asleep while watching TV. Jan woke up around 3 a.m., got ready, and drove back home. When she approached her front door, she was surprised to find it locked on both locks. This was strange, because she had told Lisa that she only had the key to the top lock. As she tried to unlock the door, Jan heard footsteps inside and thought her friend was coming to let her in. But the footsteps quickly faded, so she knocked on the door several times. When no one answered, Jan decided to go around the back of the house to try entering through the sliding door. When Jan reached the back, She saw the sliding door was slightly open. Given that it was 4 a.m., the house was dark, and no one responded to her knocks, she became seriously worried. She tried to calm herself, thinking that Lisa might have forgotten to close the door when letting out her cats. But when Jan entered the house and walked into the kitchen, her worry only grew. Family photos of Robin and her older daughter were neatly arranged on an ironing board. These photos always hung on the living room wall, so Jan was baffled. She couldn't think of any reason why Lisa or Robin would take them down and place them like that. Moreover, the house was in disarray. Many items were scattered and broken, suggesting that something terrible had happened. Jan went upstairs to her daughter's room and was met with a heartbreaking sight. Robin was laying face down on the floor beside her bed, covered in bruises, with some of her clothing pulled down. Jan rushed to her daughter and immediately realized she was dead because her body was cold. Despite this, Jan was in shock and couldn't accept what was happening. She called an ambulance and tried to save Robin, even though deep down, she knew it was too late. As the ambulance was on its way, several neighbors were awakened by Jan's loud cries. She was overwhelmed with grief, calling for help and trying to get the attention of other complex residents. The police were first to arrive at the scene. They went upstairs to Robin's room and confirmed that she was dead. But that wasn't all. In another room, officers found the body of 32-year-old Lisa on the bed. She also had visible bruises, and both bodies were handed over to medical examiners for further examination. Detectives began their investigation and quickly found the first clues. There were several cigarette butts in the house that didn't belong to either Lisa or January. On the nightstand in Jan's bedroom, police found a set of car keys for a Toyota, which could fit a wide range of models from the 1980s. It seemed the perpetrator had either accidentally left them at the scene or did so intentionally for some reason. Detectives also concluded that the perpetrator had taken a shower after the murders to wash off the blood, as it was still wet. The killer had also left his socks in the bedroom, but the police couldn't figure out why. With Jan's help, they discovered that several items were missing from the house. Lisa's driver's license, her credit cards, a checkbook, and a watch she had planned to give to her boyfriend. Notably, the watch had an engraved message from Lisa to her boyfriend, expressing her love. The selection of stolen items seemed strange to the police. The watch wasn't particularly valuable and wouldn't fetch much if resold, and the personal engraving would make it traceable. It would also be easy to track ATM withdrawals made with the stolen credit cards. So, detectives weren't quite sure why someone who committed a double murder would take these items. Regarding the photos of Robin laid out on the ironing board, detectives speculated that the perpetrator might have left this as a message either for Jan or the police. Local investigators immediately requested help from the state police, as their resources were clearly not enough for such a complex case. Forensic experts arrived at the scene and began examining the house using modern tools to find any clues. First, they determined that the perpetrator had entered the house through a bedroom window on the first floor by cutting part of the protective screen. Next, they examined Robin's bed and found some biological material on the sheets, which was sent to the lab for analysis. Although DNA testing was already in use at the time, the detectives had to wait quite a while for the results. Meanwhile, medical examiners studied the victims' bodies and determined that the cause of death for both Lisa and Robin was asphyxiation. According to the expert, the perpetrator inflicted multiple blows on them and then killed his victims using pillows. They also established that both victims had been assaulted and extracted the perpetrator's biological material from Robin's body, which was immediately sent to the lab. Experts concluded that the perpetrator had likely committed the assault after the murders. A male hair was also found on Lisa's body and was sent for analysis. While waiting for the DNA test results, the police began searching for possible suspects. They quickly got their first serious lead. Jan mentioned that for the past 3 nights, she had been woken up by strange noises. She would wake up to the sound of the gate in her yard creaking and even thought someone was opening the sliding back door. However, it was dark outside and she couldn't see if anyone was near her house. On the morning of May 9th, when it was already light out, she woke up and saw a man standing outside her window. He smiled, and then disappeared from view. Jan was frightened but decided not to call the police. She didn't get a good look at the man's face and thought he might be someone from the complex as the townhouses were connected to each other. Detectives immediately began checking Jan's neighbors, not only in their complex, but also in the nearby area. They investigated all the men, their alibis on the night of the murders, and requested DNA samples. Through this process, they identified 19 individuals who could have possibly committed the crime. Later, this list was narrowed down to 10 names, but the police couldn't confirm the involvement of any of them. When experts extracted DNA samples from the semen found on Robin's body, as well as from the sheet on her bed and pillow, they determined that all 3 samples belonged to the same man. However, there was no match in the FBI database, and the samples did not match those provided by some of the neighbors. Not all neighbors agreed to voluntarily provide their genetic material, and soon the detectives began focusing on one of these individuals. After interviewing other neighbors, they learned that this man had been repeatedly seen peeping into windows, though he had never been formally charged. Their suspicions grew when this individual suddenly moved to another state shortly after the murders. The police investigated his potential involvement and even traveled to Missouri to speak with him, but they couldn't link him to the case. When they showed Jan a photo of this man, she said he did resemble the person she saw outside her window, but his connection to the murders remained unclear. One of the residents also reported seeing an unfamiliar car at the complex territory the day before the murders. She said the car was slowly driving between the houses and a man in a red cap was behind the wheel, but the police were unable to track him down. Detectives also attempted to check all owners of Toyota cars that matched the models for the keys found in Jan's room, but this investigation did not yield any results either. Given that the perpetrator took many of Lisa's personal items, including the watch she intended to give her boyfriend, investigators considered the possibility that the murders were committed by someone who knew her well and had personal motives. They investigated her boyfriend and tried to find any ex-partners, but no evidence linked any of them to the crime. As a result, the case stalled for months. The police continued working on it, examining new suspects and comparing their DNA with the perpetrator's sample, but each lead turned into a dead end. Jan repeatedly appealed to the public, asking for any information that might help the police identify the killer. She was also puzzled by the fact that none of her neighbors heard anything that night, even though investigators believe the murderer must have made a lot of noise. The murders of Robin and Lisa were covered on national television, which brought in hundreds of tips, but none of them led to a breakthrough. About a year after the murders, the police identified a new suspect. A 27-year-old man living in the same area confessed to killing 3 different people within a few years. He also stated that if he wasn't put in jail for the rest of his life, he would kill again. Detectives working on Lisa and Robin's case investigated him, but he was found to be unrelated to their murders. Since then, there had been no progress in the case for many years. Jan occasionally gave interviews to local media, expressing hope that one day the killer would be brought to justice. The police also stated that they had not abandoned the investigation, but they simply had no new leads. In 2005, 15 years after the murders, the case was reopened. This time, the police department allocated funding for one detective to work exclusively on the case for 6 months. However, despite all the hard work, the detective was unable to get any closer to finding the perpetrator. In the following years, there were no breakthroughs in the case, but in August 2016, everything unexpectedly changed. Police from a neighboring town, located just about 6 miles from Jan's complex, arrested a 54-year-old man who had attacked his adult son with an air rifle. Although the son wasn't seriously injured, a law required the suspect to provide a DNA sample for their database. Once his DNA profile was in the system, detectives working on Lisa and Robin's case received the long-awaited match. The man's DNA was a perfect match with the 3 semen samples from the crime scene. The man's name was Joseph Ziller. Investigators immediately requested a direct DNA sample from him so experts could compare it directly with the 3 semen samples, which were still stored in the evidence warehouse. Since he was already in custody, his permission wasn't required, and the sample was quickly sent to the lab. After conducting the analysis, they confirmed a complete match, establishing that the semen from Robin's body and bed belonged to him. Joseph, who was 28 at the time of the murders, had a lengthy criminal record, mostly consisting of minor offenses. Police discovered that just 2 months after Lisa and Robin's deaths, he was arrested for selling stolen items and carrying an illegal firearm. He was sentenced to a short prison term, but at that time, the law did not require DNA samples to be taken from individuals convicted of those kind of offenses. Joseph had never been a suspect in the case and had not even been mentioned in the case materials. At the time of the murders, he lived in a neighboring town and detectives were simply unaware of his existence. Shortly after receiving a match, Joseph was arrested and the prosecution announced their intention to seek the death penalty. Joseph denied his guilt, so he was placed in jail awaiting trial. Given that his life was on the line, the preparation for the trial took several years. It began on May 8, 2023, almost exactly 33 years after the murders. With multiple DNA samples tying him to the crime scene and the body of one of the victims, Joseph had little chance of avoiding punishment, and the trial was expected to proceed without any difficulties. However, no one expected how Joseph would behave. His actions and statements in court drew the attention of millions across the country. The prosecution presented its evidence primarily based on the 3 DNA samples. The prosecutor argued that the death penalty was fully justified in this case. According to him, Joseph's actions were deliberate and he had plenty of time to change his mind. Instead, he methodically killed 2 victims, assaulted them, took some items from the house, laid out Robin's photos on the ironing board, and even took a shower. Joseph showed no signs of remorse. Since his arrest, he had nearly 7 years to confess and alleviate the suffering of the victims' families, who had been waiting for the trial to begin, but Joseph continued to maintain his innocence. When it was the turn of Joseph's lawyer to speak, he understandably could not present any significant evidence proving his client's innocence or contest the match of the 3 DNA samples. Instead, he argued that Joseph simply had no motive, suggesting that someone else committed the crime. The lawyer also claimed that based on the existing evidence, the killer must have known Jan and was trying to harm her. When Joseph took the stand, he put on quite a show. He repeatedly screamed at the jurors, the prosecutor, and even his own lawyers, hurling insults and flipping them off. When asked how his DNA ended up on Robin's bedsheet and pillow, he suddenly claimed that he had slept with her mother a few months before the incident. He added that he wasn't responsible for her not washing her bedding for months and called her a pig. Jan, who had to listen to all of this, stated that she had never seen this man before his arrest and certainly never brought him into her home. The prosecution called an expert who explained that the semen traces were clearly fresh, with documented evidence to support this claim. If they had indeed been on the fabric for several months, it would have been obvious during the initial examination. Moreover, one of the samples was found in Robin's body, which completely contradicted the defendant's version. In response, Joseph hurled more insults at Jan, ignoring his lawyer's pleas to behave properly. They tried to explain that his behavior was only helping the prosecution's case, but he refused to listen. Ultimately, it took the jury only 5 hours to deliver their verdict. They found Joseph guilty of the murders, leaving the court to decide his punishment. Joseph's behavior during the sentencing phase was also quite surprising. But more on that later. After the guilty verdict, Joseph's lawyers tried to convince the court to drop the death penalty. They pointed out that Joseph had a difficult childhood with a very strict father. They also argued that Joseph suffered from mental disorders and should not be sentenced to such a severe punishment. Additionally, the defense claimed that Joseph had lost his memory in 1998 due to a motorcycle accident. However, experts who had assessed Joseph's condition over an extended period found no evidence to support these claims. In their opinion, Joseph was fully aware of his actions, capable of planning them in advance, and eligible for the death penalty. In late June 2023, Joseph was brought into the courtroom for sentencing. As he walked to his seat, he beckoned his lawyer over and leaned in to say something, but, instead, unexpectedly elbowed his own defense attorney in the head, leading security to restrain him. Despite this dramatic turn, the lawyer chose not to press charges and continued to defend Joseph, although he couldn't protect him from the death penalty which the judge imposed. Joseph was subsequently taken to prison, where he remains to this day. Jan, along with Lisa's relatives, thanked everyone involved for bringing closure to the case. Despite Joseph never admitting guilt, his involvement in the murders left no doubt, and both victims' families finally achieved justice. It's worth mentioning that in February 2024, police arrested Joseph's 32-year-old son for possessing illegal materials involving minors, and now he is potentially facing prison time. He might even end up in the same prison where his father awaits execution.